The smartest people in the room are the hardest to fool. That's what you think, right? A guy with a degree from a top university, a woman who's published 40 papers, a fellow who can do triple integrals in his head. You'd think these people would be almost impossible to deceive. You'd think they'd spot the trick, see through the nonsense, sniff out the fraud in about 3 seconds flat. And you would be completely, totally, spectacularly wrong. In fact, I'm going to show you that it's the opposite. The smarter you are, the easier it is to fool you. And I don't mean a little easier, I mean dangerously easier. The reason why is one of the most important things I've ever learned about the way science really works. And it comes down to a single sentence that I think every person on Earth ought to hear at least once. But first, let me start with something that sounds perfectly reasonable. Intelligence is a kind of protection, right? If you're clever, you can see patterns, you can detect inconsistencies, you can reason your way through a problem while other people are still trying to figure out what the problem is. A sharp mind is like a good immune system for bad ideas. That's the picture most people carry around, and it's a very flattering picture, especially if you happen to think you're pretty sharp yourself. So you walk around feeling safe. I'm not the kind of person who falls for that stuff. You've got your diploma on the wall, you've read the right books, you can tell the difference between a real argument and a phony one. You feel vaccinated against nonsense, bulletproof. And to be fair, there are plenty of examples where intelligence seems to work exactly that way. You see an advertisement that says some pill will make you lose 30 pounds in a week, and you laugh. Somebody tells you they've invented a machine that produces more energy than you put in, runs forever, never needs fuel, and you know that violates thermodynamics, so you wave your hand and move on. You can spot those frauds, the obvious ones, the ones that are designed to catch people who haven't thought very carefully about how the world works. But I want you to notice something. Those aren't the dangerous ones. Nobody ever wrecked a field of science with a perpetual motion machine. The dangerous nonsense, the kind that actually does real damage, the kind that wastes decades of research and millions of dollars and leads people down blind alleys, it doesn't look like nonsense at all. It looks like science. It sounds like science. It wears a lab coat. It's got equations and data and published papers and peer review and conferences and keynote speakers. It's got very smart people standing behind it, people with better degrees than you, from better universities than you attended, with longer publication lists than you'll ever have. And that's exactly where the trouble begins. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named René Blondlot, a French physicist working in the city of Nancy around 1903. Not a crank, not a fool, not some guy tinkering in his garage. This was a legitimate, respected, accomplished scientist. He had done fine work on electromagnetic waves. He was a member of the French Academy of Sciences. People took him seriously because he had earned it. And Blondlot announced, with great confidence and considerable evidence, that he had discovered a new kind of radiation. He called it N-rays, after the city of Nancy where he worked. He said these rays were emitted by all sorts of sources, metals, heated objects, even the human nervous system. He said they could be refracted through an aluminum prism, and the way you detected them was subtle. You looked at a dim electric spark through a thread of calcium sulfide, and when the N-rays fell upon it, the spark got just a tiny bit brighter. Not a lot. You had to look carefully. You had to have a trained eye. But it was there. He was sure. And here's what happened next, and this is the part that really matters. Within months, other scientists started confirming his results. Not one or two, dozens of them, many of them highly respected. They published their confirmations in serious journals. The Comptes Rendus, the main publication of the French Academy of Sciences, was printing N-ray papers one after another. By the time the dust settled, nearly 100 scientific papers had been published on N-rays in a single year. Think about what that means. That's 100 separate groups of intelligent, trained people working in their own laboratories, seeing something, measuring something, reporting something, and all of them confirming each other. It looked like an open and shut case. A new form of radiation had been discovered, another triumph for French physics. There was just one small detail. N-rays did not exist. There was nothing there. The entire phenomenon was an illusion, a collective hallucination, dressed up in laboratory apparatus. And the way it was exposed is one of my favorite stories in all of science. An American physicist named Robert Wood went to visit Blondlot's laboratory in Nancy. Wood was a clever experimentalist, and he was skeptical about these N-rays. He noticed that the whole demonstration relied on subjective judgment. You had to stare at a dim spark and decide whether it got slightly brighter. There was no objective measurement, no meter, no counter, no photograph, just your eyes and your opinion. So during one of Blondlot's demonstrations, while the room was dark and Blondlot was pointing out how the N-rays were refracting through his aluminum prism and brightening the spark, Wood did something simple and devastating. He quietly reached over and removed the aluminum prism from the apparatus, just picked it up and put it in his pocket. If the N-rays were real and the prism was refracting them, then removing the prism should have changed the results completely. It should have been obvious. Blondlot noticed nothing. He kept right on reporting changes in the brightness of the spark, changes that could not possibly be happening because the key piece of equipment was sitting in Wood's coat. The whole thing was self-deception. From the very beginning, Blondlot and all those other scientists had been seeing what they wanted to see, not what was there. Now you might be tempted to feel superior. You might think, well, that was 1903. We're much more sophisticated now. Our instruments are better. Our methods are more rigorous. Our statistical techniques are more powerful. And all of that is true. But the fundamental problem has not changed by 1 inch, because the fundamental problem isn't about instruments or statistics. It's about the thing sitting between your ears. It's about what happens inside the human mind when it wants something to be true. Let me show you what I mean with another example, this one a little closer to modern science. There was a beautiful experiment done by Robert Millikan, the oil drop experiment, measuring the charge of the electron. Very famous. Millikan won the Nobel Prize partly on the strength of this work, and he got a number for the charge of the electron, a specific number. But it was a little bit wrong, a little bit too low. The reason was that he had used a slightly incorrect value for the viscosity of air in his calculations. Not a big error, not a scandal, just a small systematic mistake that pushed his answer slightly off. But here is the thing that fascinated me. If you look at the historical record of electron charge measurements after Millikan, something strange happens. You don't see people immediately jumping to the correct value. What you see is a slow, gradual drift. The next measurement was a little bit higher than Millikan's. The one after that, a little higher still, creeping upward year by year toward the value we now accept. A nice, gentle slope. Why? Because when a physicist got a number that was far from Millikan's published result, they assumed they had made an error. They'd go back and look for mistakes. They'd fiddle with the equipment, adjust the procedure, try again. They'd keep adjusting until they got something in the right neighborhood, something that didn't embarrass them by being too far from the accepted value. But when they got a number close to Millikan's, they said, "Good, that looks about right," and they stopped checking. They stopped looking for errors. You see what happened? The previous result was acting as an anchor. It was telling each experimenter when to be satisfied and when to keep worrying. And nobody was doing this on purpose. Nobody was cheating. They just had an unconscious rule. Results that agree with the master are probably right, and results that disagree are probably mistakes. But that rule, applied systematically, means you can never discover that the master was wrong. You've built the error into the system. You've locked the door and swallowed the key. And this right here is the kind of thing that happens when smart people do science without the right kind of honesty. Not dishonesty, not fraud, something much subtler and much more common. The quiet decision about when to stop looking for errors. The invisible hand that pushes your results toward what you expect. It's happening in laboratories all over the world, right now, today, and the people doing it have no idea they're doing it. Let me tell you about another example, because I think you need to see the pattern before you'll believe me. There's a phenomenon in psychology and medicine and all sorts of fields where you test whether something has an effect on people. Say you've got a new drug, and you want to know if it works. So you give it to some people, and you give a sugar pill to other people, and you compare. Standard stuff. Clinical trial. Very well-established method. But here's the problem. You run your trial, you collect your data, and you've got 30 different measurements. Blood pressure, heart rate, cholesterol, mood, sleep quality, reaction time, and on. 30 different things. And when you analyze them all, 28 of them show no difference between the drug and the sugar pill. But 2 of them, let's say cholesterol and sleep quality, show a statistically significant effect. So what do you publish? You publish a paper titled, "New Drug Improves Cholesterol and Sleep Quality." You don't mention the other 28 things you measured. Why would you? They didn't show anything interesting. But wait a minute, think about what statistics actually tells you. If you're using the standard threshold, which is a 5% chance of a false positive, and you measure 30 things, you should expect about 1.5 of those to show a significant effect purely by chance, by accident, just from the random noise in your data. So finding 2 out of 30 is exactly what you'd expect even if the drug does absolutely nothing. The 2 significant results might be meaningless. They might be ghosts, artifacts of looking at too many things at once. And the researcher who publishes those 2 results is not lying. They ran a real experiment. They used proper statistics on each individual measurement. Everything looks legitimate, but they've committed what amounts to a subtle fraud because they didn't tell you about the 28 things that didn't work. They let you think they had a specific prediction. This drug will improve cholesterol and sleep, when actually they had no prediction at all. They threw darts at a wall and drew the bullseye afterward. This happens constantly. It has a name. People call it the file drawer problem, because the negative results, the ones that show no effect, go into a file drawer and never see the light of day. And the result is that the published scientific literature, the body of knowledge that doctors and policymakers and teachers rely on, is systematically biased toward positive findings. It's like reading a book where all the chapters about failure have been ripped out. You get a wildly distorted picture of what's actually true. And I keep coming back to the same point. The people doing this are not idiots. They are not crooks. They are smart, hard-working, well-intentioned scientists who are caught in a system that rewards them for finding things and punishes them for not finding things. The incentives are all wrong. But that doesn't excuse the behavior, because the first duty of a scientist is not to their career. It's not to their grant agency. It's not to the journal editors. It's to the truth. And if the truth is that your drug doesn't work, then saying so is the most important thing you can do, more important than any positive result you could ever publish. So let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a scientist and a person who merely goes through the motions of being a scientist? You might say knowledge, you might say method, you might say training, you might say talent. But I say it's none of those things. I say the difference is a particular kind of honesty that most people, even most very intelligent people, find almost impossibly hard to sustain. I gave a talk once at Caltech, 1974. It was the commencement address, graduation day, caps and gowns and proud parents. And I decided to talk about something I called cargo cult science. You know what a cargo cult is? During the Second World War, there were islands in the South Pacific where the native people had watched American military airplanes land on airstrips. The planes brought cargo, wonderful things, canned food, tools, medicine, all sorts of goods that came from the sky like magic. Then the war ended. The soldiers left. The planes stopped coming, and the cargo stopped, so the islanders wanted it back, and they did something perfectly logical from their point of view. They recreated everything they had observed. They cleared strips of land to look like runways. They built little wooden huts that looked like control towers. They carved headphones out of coconut shells and wore them on their heads. They lit signal fires along the sides of the landing strips. They stationed a man in the hut with bamboo sticks on his ears, moving his hands the way they had seen the air traffic controllers do. Everything looked right. From a distance, you could almost believe you were looking at a real airport. They had reproduced every visible detail. But the planes did not land, because they had copied the form without understanding the substance. They had all the parts that looked like an airport, but they were missing the invisible thing that made it work. And I told those graduating students at Caltech that a lot of what passes for science in the modern world is exactly like a cargo cult. It has the form of science. It looks like science. There are laboratories and experiments and data and statistical tests and published papers and citations and review committees. All the visible apparatus of scientific inquiry. But in many cases, the essential thing is missing, the invisible thing, the thing you can't see from the outside. And what is that thing? I call it scientific integrity. But I don't mean integrity in the ordinary sense, like not stealing or not lying. I mean something much more specific and much harder. I mean the habit, the discipline, the practice of bending over backwards to show how you might be wrong. Not how you're right, how you might be wrong. See, if you're doing an experiment and you know there are possible sources of error, you have a duty to think about every single one of them, not just the ones that are convenient to think about, not just the ones you know how to fix, all of them, even the ones you'd rather ignore, especially the ones you'd rather ignore. And you have a duty to report them openly in your paper so that other people can judge for themselves how much to trust your result. This is the thing that smart people are worst at, because a smart person can always think of a reason to dismiss the inconvenient data. Oh, that measurement was probably contaminated. That subject was obviously an outlier. Those conditions weren't quite right, so we can set that trial aside. And each of those excuses might even be true, but if you only apply that level of scrutiny to the data that goes against your theory and never to the data that supports it, then you're not doing science. You've got the wooden headphones and the coconut radio. You've got every part of the airport except the part that makes the planes come. Let me give you a specific example of what real integrity looks like, because I think we need more models of this. There was a man named Young, a researcher who did experiments on rats in mazes. He was trying to figure out how rats navigate. What information are they actually using? Is it the smell of the food? Is it the color of the walls? Is it the pattern of light? He was a careful man, and he started eliminating cues one at a time. And what he discovered was remarkable. He found that rats are fantastically sensitive to cues that experimenters didn't even realize were there. The sounds the floor makes when the rat walks on it. Tiny differences in smell from one arm of the maze to another. Vibrations in the building. Changes in air current. The rat was picking up on things that the experimenter had never thought to control for. And if you didn't control for these things, your results were meaningless. You thought you were studying learning, but you were actually studying the rat's ability to notice which floorboard squeaked differently. This was an incredibly important finding. It meant that a large number of published rat experiments done by serious researchers at serious universities and published in serious journals were unreliable. Their conclusions might be completely wrong because they hadn't controlled for cues they didn't know existed. Did the rest of the psychology community adopt Young's controls? Did they start building their mazes more carefully? They did not. His papers were published, read, and quietly ignored, not because anyone could find a flaw in his work. His work was meticulous, but because taking it seriously would have meant admitting that a lot of previous work was questionable. It would have meant going back and redoing experiments. It would have been expensive and inconvenient and embarrassing. So the field just stepped around it like walking around a puddle and kept doing things the old way. And that tells you something important about the real enemy of good science. The enemy is not stupidity. A stupid mistake can be found and fixed. The enemy is not malice. Deliberate fraud is rare and usually gets caught eventually. The real enemy is something much more common and much harder to fight. The real enemy is convenience, the desire to get a publishable result without too much trouble, the desire to confirm what you already believe without the tedious work of trying to disprove it, the desire to not go back and redo the work you've already done, because that would mean admitting the first round might have been wrong. Smart people feel all of these desires. They feel them just as strongly as anyone else, sometimes more strongly, because they've invested more in their ideas. A graduate student who has spent 4 years on a thesis has an enormous emotional and practical investment in the thesis being correct.